Are there actually mysterious pyramids in Bosnia? Is there a Sphinx in Pakistan predating the one in Egypt? Are the oldest pyramids in the world in Indonesia? These are ancient structures that could be evidence of advanced technology. In Bosnia, there's a site called Visoko, where some believe there are ancient pyramids hidden underneath layers and layers of dirt. Now, the Bosnian government, along with a lot of archaeologists, claim these are just natural formations, but a group of researchers, including a man named Dr. Samir Osmaganak, insist that they're man-made pyramids, possibly built over 12,000 years ago. If there really are pyramids here, they're also interestingly positioned. They align perfectly with the cardinal points, and the materials used seem unusual. The stones are said to be fitted very precisely, and that there's some sort of bizarre energy field around them. Some even claim these pyramids could be harnessing energy like a power plant. The biggest pyramid, known as the Pyramid of the Sun, has led some to wonder that the people who built it had access to advanced construction methods, possibly even technology that we don't know about today. Gunung Padang is a hill in Indonesia, but under that hill is a massive man-made structure that might be older than the Great Pyramids. There's been debate around the site for years. Some researchers think it's the remnants of an ancient pyramid complex. They've done carbon dating here, which has shown that it could be 20,000 years old, possibly even older. The core of the site is made up of huge, precisely cut stone blocks, and there's evidence that the structure was built in layers over time. The entire site seems to be built on top of a massive underground chamber, and if you ask some researchers, they'll tell you that it lines up with the positions of stars and planets. Basically, it looks like the ancient people who built it knew a lot about how the night sky worked and could track things like the stars and planets, maybe even using that knowledge for things like farming or rituals. For as mysterious as the site is, it doesn't get nearly as much attention as places like Stonehenge, for example, but it might have been home to a civilization way more advanced than we ever have imagined. In Baluchistan, a province in Pakistan, there's a rock formation that looks like this. Now, what's the first thing that comes to mind looking at this thing? Well, it looks eerily similar to the Sphinx in Egypt, doesn't it? The formation is carved, or rather formed, out of the side of a hill, and I say it could be formed because it's not entirely clear whether this thing was naturally formed or not. But it doesn't match the time frame we'd expect of any ancient civilization in the area. Some think it could be the remnants of a lost civilization, possibly dating back over 10,000 years, well before the Egyptians ever carved their version. The idea that there was an advanced civilization in this part of the world, not as famous as Egypt or Mesopotamia, is pretty mind-blowing, but also kind of frustrating because we don't have any solid proof. Some think this rock formation came from some unknown ancient civilization who had the tech to carve massive statues with crazy precision, and maybe even had the know-how to line them up with stars or solstices, kind of like the Egyptians did. Others think this is just a naturally formed rock that just happens to look like the Sphinx, but what do you all think? Karnak in Luxor, Egypt is one of the most impressive temple complexes ever built. It was dedicated to the Theban triad Amun, Mut, and Khonsu, and construction began around 4,000 years ago. The scale of this place is just insane. It spans over 200 acres, and inside it are massive stone pillars, each weighing several tons, and as you can tell, looking at these images, its design and construction were incredibly advanced. The walls are decorated with astronomical alignments and star maps too. The Egyptians probably had an even deeper understanding of the cosmos than we give them credit for. The precision of the architecture here is just amazing. The stones were cut with such exactness that they fit together without mortar, something that still baffles experts today. And the pillars, they're not just massive, they're carved with such detail that it's hard to believe ancient people had the tools to do something like this.
Moving on to number 7. The lost city of Petra. Located in present-day Jordan, the lost city of Petra was the capital of the Nabatean kingdom, an ancient Arab civilization that prospered from the 4th century BCE to the 2nd century CE. The city was the center of a kingdom 4 times the size of modern Jordan, and had a sophisticated water management system. However, one of Petra's most distinctive features is its rock-cut architecture, where temples, tombs, theaters, and other structures structures were carved directly into the rose-red sandstone cliffs. Plus, the Nabateans were kings along the trading routes, which contributed to its prosperity. That being said, archaeologists estimate the people began to abandon the city around the 7th and 8th centuries, and the city was largely forgotten until it was rediscovered by a Swiss explorer in 1812. While the reason for the decline of a once prosperous kingdom is rather mysterious, it's thought that various natural disasters such as flash floods and earthquakes forced the city's inhabitants to leave all those years ago. Moving on to number 6, Khmer Empire. The Khmer Empire was a powerful and influential civilization that ruled over a vast territory in Southeast Asia, centered in what is now Cambodia, from the 9th to the 15th century, but the height of its power was around the 12th century. The Khmer Empire is renowned for many things. For starters, they had magnificent temple complexes with intricate carvings, towering structures, and innovative engineering. They also developed advanced systems of water management, including reservoirs, canals, and irrigation networks, which enabled the empire to thrive agriculturally and sustain its population for thousands of years. However, strangely, by 1500, the entire city had been abandoned and began being taken over by the jungle. And while scholars can't agree as to why the city fell, there are many theories. Some have suggested war with a neighboring kingdom, others say it was due to religious disputes, natural disaster, or just neglect of public works. Even so, the Khmer Empire remains a significant chapter in the history of South Asia to this day, and the details are still being uncovered. Moving on to number 5, the Olmec civilization. The Olmecs developed their civilization along the Gulf of Mexico around 1400 to 400 BCE, and are often referred to as the mother culture of Mesoamerica because they laid the foundation for many later civilizations in the area. Now, being the mother culture and all, the Olmecs are known for many significant cultural achievements, including distinctive art style, monumental architecture, complex spirituality, societal organization, and they are credited with some of the earliest known writing and calendar systems in Mesoamerica. So, what happened to them? Truthfully, the reason for the decline of the Olmec civilization is not entirely clear, but as of 300 BCE, all archaeological evidence of the society disappeared. Even stranger, all their graves vanished. So it's impossible to determine why or if they were killed by disease or by force. Some theories suggest the Olmecs died out famine, war, or natural disaster, but there is very little that has yet to be determined for sure. Moving on to number 4, Greenland's Vikings. According to Icelandic sagas, Eric the Red led a fleet of 25 boats to colonize Greenland around 985 AD, after he was temporarily banished from Iceland for manslaughter. The plan was to set up 2 colonies, a smaller one on the west and a large one on the east, which they achieved. The Vikings herded goats, sheep, and cattle, built stone churches, hunted caribou and seals, and appeared to be thriving, or at least surviving, with a population of roughly 5,000 for hundreds of years. However, when a missionary expedition arrived in 1721 with the goal of converting them into Protestants, they found nothing but ruins. Since the missionaries' arrival, experts have been able to decipher that the small western colony failed around 1400, and the eastern colony followed a few decades later, but the reason why is still up for debate. The Little Ice Age in the 14th century was likely a factor, as it clogged the route in and out of Greenland and shortened already marginal growing seasons. Plus, the market for walrus ivory collapsed, and that was Vikings' main export. So it could have been a multitude of things that led to the decline. Where did the people go? Well, some experts believe they simply packed up and returned to Iceland. Others think they starved to death, died of disease, or were killed by the Inuit, who had arrived around 1200, but we might never really know. Moving on to number 3, 3. Cahokia. Sometimes referred to as America's Forgotten City, Cahokia was an ancient indigenous city located in what is now southern Illinois that was regarded as the center of the Mississippian culture and was renowned for its monumental earthen mounds, complex social structure, and sophisticated urban planning. In its prime from 1050 to 1200, it is estimated to have been one of the largest cities, supporting a population of 10,000 to 20,000. Further, Cahokia's strategic location along major rivers contributed to its role as a trade center, and it was well known for having a flourishing social structure, including artisans, farmers, religious leaders, among others. Even so, by the time 1400 came around, long before Columbus arrived in America, nearly all the previously inhabited mounds were abandoned, and the city became a ghost town. No one knows for sure why the city was abandoned, but overhunting, deforestation, disease, and flooding have all been tossed out as theories. Still, it remains a huge mystery. Moving on to number 2, Anksumite Empire. From the 1st century AD to the 7th, there was an ancient civilization located in the region of present-day Ethiopia and Eritrea called the Anksumite Empire. And interestingly, it was one of the first civilizations to adopt Christianity as the state religion. So much so that the empire's rulers constructed impressive obelisks and churches, many of which still stand today. Now, aside from Christianity, the Anksumite Empire was also known for their unique and advanced coinage system that they used for trade. This, paired with the location of their trade routes, became a prominent factor in their rise to exporting goods such as ivory, gold, spices, and textiles. In fact, at one point it said they were trading with all of Africa. But still, the empire eventually fell around the 7th century for unknown reasons, and the mystery as to why has puzzled historians for decades. Some experts think it was climate change, others believe the city was defeated by a Jewish queen and her invading army, but the truth remains a big mystery to this day. And last up in our number 1 spot, Indus Valley. The Indus began building settlements in present-day India and Pakistan as early as 8,000 years ago, making them one of the earliest civilizations recorded. But the fascinating and mysterious thing about the ancient Indus society is that we should know more about them than we do. By the 3rd millennium BC, they occupied over 386,000 square miles of territory, which was way more than Egypt or Mesopotamia, and they accounted for an estimated 10% of the world's population. Yet somehow they are shrouded in much more mystery. Further archaeological evidence suggests Indus was a highly advanced society, characterized by well-planned and sophisticated urban centers, advanced irrigation systems far better than the Romans, and successful trade systems with regions as far away as Mesopotamia, now modern-day Iraq. From what archaeologists have been able to decipher, the Indus Valley civilization was at its peak around 2500 BCE, but somewhere around 1800 BCE, people began to abandon the cities, and no one knows exactly why. Some theories suggest that the river dried up, while others cite a flood or invasion, but as of today, their disappearance is still up for debate.
The Sumerians weren't just one of the first civilizations, they were also one of the strangest. These guys popped up out of nowhere seemingly around 3100 BCE in what's now Iraq, bringing with them advanced knowledge of writing, astronomy, and law. And there's also something else they're known for though. Their myths, more specifically the Anunnaki, beings who came down from the heavens and were said to have given them their knowledge. Now, ancient people talking about receiving knowledge from a higher power isn't all that unique, you're going to hear it more on this list as well, but some think that the Sumerians were actually describing an alien race. See, some of their artwork seems to show figures that look eerily like modern depictions of aliens, tall, slender, and humanoid, but not really, and of course, coming from the sky. They also wrote about these beings, describing how the Anunnaki created humans to do hard labor, like digging canals and working the land. Well, some theorists take their story and say, well, what if creating humans
actually meant genetic engineering. Were the Sumerians just writing myth, or were they actually recording something much more literal? Some researchers believe the Sumerians' rapid advancement doesn't make sense without some kind of outside influence either. How did they develop advanced irrigation and the world's first cities almost overnight? And let's not forget their knowledge of the solar system. Some of their texts describe the night sky in ways that were pretty ahead of their time, so is it possible they were getting their astronomy lessons from advanced beings from another planet? You probably don't need me to tell you that the Maya were ahead of their time. They had insanely accurate calendars, complex cities, and a deep understanding of the cosmos, so it probably comes as no surprise that they're often associated with theories about ancient aliens. Here's where a lot of that comes from. Some of their carvings and artifacts look like they're depicting figures in spacesuits. One of the most famous examples is the lid of Pakal's tomb. Some say it shows him piloting what looks like a spacecraft, with buttons and knobs and controls and what looks like a breathing apparatus and flames shooting out at the bottom. Traditional archaeologists say it's just a stylized representation of the afterlife or something, but let's be real, if you showed that carving to someone with zero context, they'd probably say it looks like a dude in some sort of spaceship or something just advanced for the time. And then there's their obsession with the gods descending from the sky, often depicted with serpentine or bird-like features. Now, was this just fantasy, or were they actually recording encounters with beings from up in space? Their myths even mention beings known as the Star People, who supposedly came down to teach them wisdom. Some of their temples and pyramids also line up with stars and planets in a way that makes it seem like they knew way more about space than you'd think possible for such an ancient society. So were they just a highly advanced civilization, or did they have a little guidance from up above? Ancient Indian texts are full of wild descriptions of these flying machines called vimanas. These weren't just vague mentions of something flying through the sky. These texts go into crazy detail about the mechanics, the weapons, and even the fuel these crafts supposedly used. The Mahabharata and Ramayana talk about epic aerial battles, beams of light that could destroy entire cities, and weapons that sound suspiciously like modern-day nukes. Now, of course, most people think these stories are just myths, but some believe they may have been describing real events, possibly involving extraterrestrial technology. And even stranger, some of these texts describe the Vimanas as being piloted by beings with godlike abilities, often descending from the heavens to interact with humans. Were these just religious visions, or did these ancient people have a more literal understanding of what was going on? Whether or not these texts are just stories, it's pretty cool that they sound more like science fiction than your more traditional mythological tales.
Aksum in Ethiopia was the center of a powerful ancient empire. The most famous thing here are the giant obelisks, massive stone columns, some over 70 feet tall and weighing hundreds of tons. So how were these giant stones moved around? There were no cranes, no heavy machinery, all they had were basic tools. So how'd they manage it? Precision in the carvings and the way the stones fit together with no mortar is incredible. It's almost like they had some kind of secret technology for shaping and transporting these blocks, but we have no idea what that could have been. The obelisks are even aligned perfectly with cardinal points, like they had a deep understanding of geometry and the stars. Some people think this might point to lost tech or knowledge they had that we've just lost track of over time. How did they do this with what should have been limited resources? It's still a mystery. Baalbek in Lebanon, this place is straight up wild. The Temple of Jupiter here has some of the biggest stone blocks that you will ever see. Some of them weigh over 800 tons. That's way heavier than anything we see at the Great Pyramid of Giza. And here's the thing, archaeologists say they moved these massive blocks with simple tools and manpower. The blocks are cut so precisely and fit together so tightly, it's hard to believe they were just stacked with ropes and pulleys. Plus, there are these detailed carvings and perfectly laid foundations that have survived earthquakes and centuries of time. How did they do this? Some think they could have had tools or techniques that we, again, just have lost today. Maybe even stuff like advanced machinery or some lost form of energy. Geoglyphs are these massive, ancient, and mysterious earthworks that we see when we look down from above with a bird's eye view. You can find geoglyphs all over the world, but one of the craziest discoveries came in 2000 2007 when a guy named Dmitry Day in Kazakhstan started using Google Earth to see if there were any in his country. And after perusing maps for a while, he spotted something. There were over 260 giant shapes scattered across the landscape. The biggest one, an intricate square, is even bigger than the base of the Great Pyramid of Giza. At first, people thought that this was all a hoax, but after NASA got satellite images and confirmed these findings, it was clear there was something there. From the ground, it doesn't make much sense, but once you're above, shapes start to reveal themselves. Crosses, squares, lines, rings, and mounds. The whole thing changes how we view ancient nomads. These structures show that whoever built them had some serious organization and manpower, which is a huge surprise since nomads were typically seen as, well, not exactly big on staying in one place long enough to do heavy construction like this. As for how old they are and exactly what they were made for, nobody's sure. But they might have been created by the Mahadzar culture from 7,000 to 5,000 BCE. The Ica stones are a collection of carved volcanic rocks found in Peru. They come in all sizes, from small ones that will fit just in the palm of your hand to massive boulders over a foot wide. Now, these ones aren't famous for being hundreds of tons or anything like that. The evidence of possible advanced technology here comes from what's carved into the stones. And sure, you have your typical scenes of animals and humans wearing ceremonial headdresses, but some stones show much stranger stuff, images that appear to show advanced medical procedures, like heart and brain surgeries, C-sections, organ transplants. There are also carvings of people looking up at the stars through what look to be telescopes, and there are dinosaurs. Lots and lots of dinosaurs, except these stones would have been created long after they were extinct. It's all just very strange. So how did these people possibly have such advanced knowledge, way beyond what was thought possible for ancient civilizations? We don't know. And we don't know anything about the people who created these things either. There's no other evidence of their society. There are no ruins or other artifacts. We just have these stones. Derinkuyu is an ancient underground city in Turkey that's over 2,000 years old. It's massive, with multiple levels and hundreds of rooms, and it's pretty sophisticated for something built such a long time ago. The whole place seems like it was designed with real engineering know-how. Things like an advanced ventilation system that keeps fresh air flowing, even deep underground. Then there are things like giant stone doors that could be rolled into place, shutting off entire sections of the city for protection. It's clear a lot of thought went into its design. The underground city is about 280 feet deep and could house up to 20,000 people, along with their animals and food supplies. It's everything you'd need to live down there: wine and oil presses, stables, storage rooms, chapels. One of the rooms is thought to have been a religious school, with nearby spaces used for studying. Over the centuries, the city was used to shelter people during invasions, but eventually it was forgotten about, and it just stayed hidden until 1963, when a homeowner renovating his place found it all by accident. He'd been chasing a chicken that ran into a hole in his basement when he found this whole network of underground tunnels. By 1969, parts of Derinkuyu were open to the public, and now you can explore about half of this underground city. Alright, now we couldn't do a list about ancient structures and possible advanced technology without mentioning the pyramids of Giza. The Great Pyramid, in particular, is just insane. Made up of 2.3 million blocks, some that weigh 80 tons. There have been a lot of theories, debates, and conspiracies over the years about how the ancient Egyptians managed to cut, move, and stack these massive stones so precisely without anything like cranes or other modern tools. It's even crazier based on the fact that these pyramids are still standing just as they did all those years ago. The mainstream explanation is usually that they used copper tools and like ramps and pulleys. We've never had a definitive explanation, and don't even get me started on the pyramid's alignment. It's aligned almost perfectly with the cardinal points of the Earth, and even has some pretty crazy astronomical alignments. It's obvious they had a pretty advanced understanding of the stars and the Earth's movements, way ahead of their time.
Starting off this list, in our number 10 spot, we have the advanced civilization. There's a claim that might keep you up at night. During Joe Rogan's conversation with Graham Hancock, the two discussed the idea of a civilization so old it dates back to the last ice age. Graham says bluntly, a major advanced civilization existed more than 12,000 years ago. That puts us in a timeline that shatters the usual textbook story, which insists major civilizations only popped up a few thousand 12,000 years before Christ. The conversation references the Younger Dryas impact theory, more on that later, suggesting multiple comet fragments slammed into Earth around 12,800 years ago. If that really happened, entire cultures might have been wiped out, leaving behind only scattered hints like mysterious megalithic sites. Some archaeologists, like one featured in the same episode, Flint Dibble, are deeply skeptical, but as Hancock puts it, we have forgotten an episode of the human story, and he wants to find out exactly which chapter was torn from the record. Next, we are talking about Göbekli Tepe. Göbekli Tepe gets thrown into the spotlight for fueling suspicions of an ancient apocalypse. On the Joe Rogan Experience, Graham Hancock points to this 11,600-year-old site in southeastern Turkey as the smoking gun. He describes stone pillars weighing tons that were arranged at a time conventional wisdom labels a simple hunter-gatherer era. If these were just tiny bands of nomads, how did they manage such advanced stonework? Hancock hints it's evidence they inherited skills from a lost society. In the episode, there's talk about a lost civilization that existed well before recognized ancient cultures, and Göbekli Tepe becomes the prime suspect, challenging folks who assume civilization just started out of nowhere in places like Sumer. Next up, we are talking about the Sphinx secret. The Sphinx might be holding an age-old secret that rewrites everything about ancient Egypt. Hancock references a geologist's rain weathering argument, saying that there's heavy rain weathering on the Sphinx enclosure, which could make it 9,000 or even 10,000 years old, way beyond the Old Kingdom's timeline. What sets chills down your spine is Hancock's suggestion that the Sphinx may have aligned with the constellation Leo around 12,000 plus years ago. I don't think anyone knows how they did it, Rogan remarks, referring to those incredible monuments. The episode quotes an archaeologist, Flint Dibble, who dismisses these claims, but the conflict remains. If that sculpture really is thousands of years older than standard history says, are we missing an entire layer of advanced Egyptian prehistory?
The Inca built one of the most impressive empires in history, and they did it without the wheel, iron tools, or a writing system, at least not one we can fully understand. But their stonework is where things get really weird. Sites like Sacsayhuaman have massive, perfectly cut stones that fit together without mortar, almost like a puzzle, and some of these stones weigh over 100 tons, and we still don't know exactly how they moved and shaped them like that. Some say it was just good old-fashioned manpower and ingenuity, but others think they might have had some help. The legends of the Inca mention sky gods who came down and taught them knowledge. Were these just mythological figures, or could they have been something else entirely? The Dogon people of Mali have a knowledge of astronomy that's bizarrely advanced for a tribe that by all accounts shouldn't have had access to telescopes. Specifically, they've known about Sirius B, a white dwarf star invisible to the naked eye, for centuries. Western astronomers didn't confirm its existence until the 20th century, but the Dogon had detailed knowledge about it long before that. They claim they got this information from beings called the Nomo, amphibious, fish-like deities from the Sirius system who came from the sky and brought knowledge. Again, this sounds a lot like extraterrestrial contact, but is it just a myth? Did they just figure out everything they know on their own? Or were they actually visited by beings from the Sirius system? China's mythology is full of sky beings, flying chariots and rulers who claim to be descended from celestial visitors. One of the most famous examples is the Yellow Emperor, who was said to have arrived on a flying dragon and later ascended back into the heavens. Then there are the carvings and artifacts showing figures with elongated skulls and strange non-human features. Some even resemble what modern UFO enthusiasts would call gray aliens. There are also ancient accounts of metallic flying machines, energy weapons, and even what some interpret as nuclear explosions in early Chinese texts. So, again, could these stories be describing actual encounters with extraterrestrials, or are they just highly exaggerated myths? Given China's long history and meticulous record keeping, it's not hard to wonder if some of these stories have more truth to them than we may think. Ancient Greece may not be the first place that comes to mind when thinking about alien contact, but their mythology, their advanced technology, it does make you wonder. The Greeks had gods and beings that descended from the sky, often in glowing chariots or surrounded by radiant light. You could interpret that as something of a UFO encounter. Take Prometheus, for example, who stole fire from the gods and gave it to humanity. Could this be a metaphor for advanced knowledge gifted to early humans by an otherworldly being? Then there's more concrete stuff like the Antikythera mechanism, an ancient analog computer discovered in a shipwreck. This thing was capable of things that wouldn't be matched for over 1,000 years. Where did the Greeks get this level of understanding? Was it purely because they were just that smart, or is it possible they had some divine inspiration, maybe from beings beyond Earth? Here's another strange little curiosity: accounts of flying shields seen in battle, reported by historians like Herodotus. Was this just dramatic storytelling? Or were ancient Greek soldiers actually seeing aircraft thousands of years before modern UFO reports? The Karlsupe civilization in Peru is one of the oldest in the Americas, dating back to around 3000 BCE. Yet they built massive pyramids, had complex urban planning, and even developed a mysterious form of record keeping using knotted strings. They seem to have done this with no outside influence, at least no influence that we know of. Unlike other ancient civilizations, the Karlsupe didn't leave behind a lot of warlike artifacts. Signs of massive conflicts, no battle records, just peaceful, advanced city building. Some researchers believe this points to them having had help from a superior intelligence that guided them toward a civilization focused on science and trade rather than conflict and power. There's also the uncanny similarity between their pyramids and those found in Egypt. How did these two civilizations, separated by thousands of miles, come up with the same type of structures? Was it just a coincidence, or were they both following the same blueprint, one that might not have originated on Earth? The Nazca people lived in what's now Peru between 100 BCE and 800 CE, and they left behind something that still baffles people today: these massive geoglyphs known as the Nazca lines. We're talking giant animals, humanoid figures, and geometric shapes all etched into the desert floor. The thing is, you can really only see them from way up in the air. And this is where the alien theories come in. Some believe the Nazca made these lines as messages or landing strips for extraterrestrial visitors. After all, why go through all that effort to make something you couldn't even fully appreciate from the ground? There's also the theory that the Nazca had help from advanced beings who guided them in creating these massive designs. Obviously, there are skeptics who argue that they were purely ceremonial or meant to be seen from surrounding hills, but the fact that some lines stretch for miles and form perfectly straight paths, it does make you wonder who or what were they trying to communicate with? Well, of course, no list of possible alien-influenced civilizations would be complete without ancient Egypt. The pyramids alone have had people speculating things for centuries. These massive structures are so precisely built that modern engineers still aren't completely sure how they were constructed. The Great Pyramid of Giza, for example, is aligned almost perfectly with the true north, and the measurements of its base are oddly connected to the dimensions of the Earth itself. Did the Egyptians really figure this out on their own? Or did someone or something give them the knowledge? Then there are these strange depictions in Egyptian art. Some carvings show beings with particularly large eyes, what look like advanced devices. Even more bizarre are the light bulb carvings in the Dendera temple, which some believe depicted electrical technology. Egyptian mythology also talks about the gods descending from the sky and sharing knowledge with humanity. Were these gods just myths, or were they actual beings from another world? If so, what was their purpose in guiding one of the most powerful civilizations in history? El Dorado is often pictured as this legendary city of gold, but its origins are actually tied to a real tradition among the indigenous people of South America. The term originally referred to a king, El Rey Dorado, who was said to cover himself in gold dust and submerge himself in Lake Guatavita as part of a ritual. Over time, explorers and treasure hunters turned this story into an idea of an entire city filled with gold, which spurred on all these wild adventures and quests. In the 16th century, Spanish conquistadors searched for El Dorado across the Andes, exploring areas in present-day Colombia and Venezuela. Some actually claimed to have seen evidence of golden cities filled with riches, but the mythical golden city of El Dorado itself was never found. The idea has persisted in pop culture though. I must have seen that animated El Dorado movie like 12 times when I was little. Now, could this place really have existed though? Well, maybe not exactly how it was described, but there were incredibly impressive cities in the region at the time with architecture that would have been otherworldly to the Spanish. Agartha is said to be a hidden city or civilization deep within the earth. The idea became popular in the 19th century, especially with the writings of people like Jules Verne. Later, a number of occultists also began talking about it. According to these stories, Agartha is home to advanced beings with superior technology and knowledge, living in harmony away from the chaos of the surface world. Many believe that Agartha is connected to a series of underground tunnels and cities, with one of the most famous entrances said to be in Tibet. It's said to be this vast, lush paradise filled with light and greenery. Agartha is, pun intended, at the center of the hollow earth theory, that the planet has these large spaces beneath it that are inhabited by ancient civilizations. Agartha is also sometimes associated with spiritual teachings, claiming that its inhabitants have mastered enlightenment and hold secrets to the universe. Some conspiracy theories even suggest that world leaders have access to this place, possibly even coming from there. Along with the enlightened, more human-like beings, Agartha is also said to be home to malicious reptilians who've been sneaking to the surface, disguising themselves as humans and integrating themselves into our society in prominent positions in politics in order to control us from the inside. The legend of the lost continent of Mu is said to be a massive landmass that existed in the Pacific Ocean and supposedly sank beneath the waves thousands of years ago. Mu started being talked about after a book by British author, engineer, and inventor James Churchward, who claimed to have discovered ancient tablets that described Mu as a highly advanced civilization. And according to him, Mu is home to millions of people with impressive cities and incredible technology, and that the people of Mu were responsible for a lot of the ancient cultures around the world, like those in Egypt and Mesopotamia. Basically, that they spread their knowledge before their continent was lost. Now, today, Churchward's theories are mostly considered pseudoscience, but there are some people who believe or are just fascinated by the idea that there might be remnants of Mu submerged underwater, and there have been expeditions to try and pinpoint where it could have been. There are even those who think that underwater structures like the Yonaguni Monument in Japan could have been part of Mu.
Next up, we are talking about Atlantis. Atlantis is more than just a myth, if you ask this crowd. In the episodes, Hancock emphasizes that Plato got the story from Egyptian priests who apparently told Solon about a massive flood destroying a powerful civilization. So maybe it's not just some Greek philosopher's fantasy. Joe Rogan and guests compare these tales to global flood myths, cultural memories of real cataclysms. We've had so many of these flood traditions, Hancock points out, hinting that they all might be referencing the same meltdown at the end of the Ice Age. The terrifying thought is that a sophisticated empire was wiped off the map, leaving behind only the vaguest legends about a sunken land. Next, we are talking about the Olmec colossal heads. Olmec heads spark talk of ancient connections across the seas. On Rogan's podcast, Hancock mentions those colossal stone heads in Mexico, dated around 1000 BC, but sporting features nobody can fully explain. Could there have been transoceanic voyages long before Columbus? These legends aren't just made up, Hancock insists, suggesting older influences might have seeded knowledge in places like Mesoamerica. Critics fire back, saying mainstream archaeology sees no proof of major sea travel back then, yet the notion that some bearded teachers popped up in the New World keeps fueling theories of a shared prehistoric culture. Next, we are talking about the stone spheres in Costa Rica. The stone spheres in Costa Rica get a nod as another unsolved puzzle. Hancock references these perfectly round boulders, some bigger than a car, that mainstream scholars date to around 500 to 1500 CE. Yet he argues no one really knows their age because stone is notoriously hard to pin down. Joe Rogan calls them a total mystery, and the speculation ramps steps up? Did they come from a pre-flood society with advanced tools, or are they just the result of local artisans? The episode captures that sense of awe, with Hancock insisting they could be leftovers of an earlier epoch that we haven't even considered yet. Next, we are talking about the missing history. An overarching claim that hits hard is the idea that we missed an entire episode of humanity's saga. We've forgotten an episode of human history, Hancock says, laying out how megalithic structures, possibly comet impacts, and swirling legends all converge on a single conclusion. Some primal civilization thrived in the late Ice Age, then vanished under violent cataclysms. Joe Rogan, clearly fascinated, hammers on the point that mainstream archaeology might not be completely wrong, but could have huge blind spots. This tension sets the stage for a more sinister question. If advanced societies got obliterated once, could it happen again? In our number 3 spot today, we are talking about the Younger Dryas impact theory. The Younger Dryas impact hypothesis demands attention as one of those topics from Rogan's interviews that sounds like it's sci-fi, but might be rooted in actual, real science. Graham Hancock aligns with the researchers finding nanodiamonds, platinum anomalies, and other cosmic markers suggesting that Earth got hammered by comet fragments 12,800 years ago. Flint, the archaeologist, fires back that recent papers refute a large-scale impact, but Hancock is not convinced. He references Randall Carlson's work, impact proxies spanning large swaths, implying that if the event was catastrophic, entire cultures would have been vaporized. That angle might explain the near-total absence of direct evidence for such an advanced Ice Age civilization. Next up, we are talking about Gunung Padang. This place in Indonesia enters the ring as a bizarre hillside that some suspect might contain layers from 20,000 years ago. On one podcast episode, Hancock describes it as a possible pyramid hidden under centuries of soil and vegetation. Skeptics, including some from the episode, Flint Dibble, say deeper scans are misread or that it's just natural formations, but supporters retort that a lost civilization, as Hancock phrases it, could have built the lower terraces well before mainstream timelines. If the site truly goes back that far, it might be physical proof that people had complex building techniques when woolly mammoths were still roaming around. And finally, in our number 1 spot today, we have the Eye of the Sahara. The Eye of the Sahara caps off this wild list by being pitched as the literal site of Atlantis. During that Mauritania-themed discussion, both speakers compared the geological and historical details to Plato's words about concentric rings of land and water, matching stone colors red, black, and white, and other features described by Plato make the location eerily on point. Rogan's show even dives into how catastrophic flooding, possibly tied to the Younger Dryas meltdown, could have obliterated that city. Perhaps the creepiest angle is that Egyptian records might have referenced this exact place, meaning the biggest archaeological smoking gun in history could be sitting in plain sight in the Sahara. Starting off this list, in our number 10 spot, we have the Mayan calendar. The Mayans weren't just stargazers, they were timekeepers. Their complex calendar system, known as the Mayan long count, is one of the most precise in history. It tracked time over cycles, and while it famously predicted the end of the world in 2012, it may have been more about the cycles than finality. This calendar wasn't just a tool for marking days, it could have been a map to the future. Many believe the Mayans used this intricate understanding of time to predict not only celestial events, but societal shifts and even the rise and fall of civilizations. Could the Mayans have known more about the future than just the end of their calendar? Next, we are talking about the Antikythera mechanism. Discovered off the coast of Greece in 1901, the Antikythera mechanism looks like something out of a science fiction novel. This ancient device, often considered the world's first analog computer, was used to track astronomical positions and predict eclipses. But what if this wasn't just a tool for navigation or observation? Some theorists believe it could have been the first attempt at time travel technology, designed to predict not only the movements of the stars, but also to predict major events in history, possibly giving the ancients glimpses into future occurrences. Could this ancient Greek invention have had a deeper purpose, one that we still don't fully understand? Next, we are talking about the Oracle of Delphi. The Oracle of Delphi was more than just a spiritual guide. She was the voice of Apollo, believed to predict the future. Ancient Greeks flocked to Delphi seeking answers to life's toughest questions, from the fate of nations to personal decisions. Her cryptic prophecies often seemed vague, but many historians believe she tapped into something more profound, perhaps a connection to future timelines. Some even suggest that the oracle's visions were not just inspired by the gods, but could have been glimpses of possible futures, offering a snapshot of what was to come. Was the oracle truly receiving divine messages, or was she unlocking the door to time itself?
The mythical city of the Caesars is said to be hidden somewhere in the Andes Mountains of South America, a magnificent city filled with riches and advanced technology ruled by powerful kings, very similar to El Dorado. The legend became popular in the 19th century with a number of explorers claiming that they'd heard tales of this city from locals, and according to the stories, the city of the Caesars is filled with gold and precious gems. Some stories even say that the kings never aged there, and have all this secret knowledge about the universe. Some believe that the city might be protected by natural barriers or perhaps even magical forces, making it nearly impossible to discover. There are tales of expeditions that have gotten close but ultimately failed to find it. Thule. Now, this is a term that's appeared in ancient texts, often referring to a distant northern land. The Greek explorer Pytheas Massalia mentioned Thule in the 4th century BCE, describing it as a place of extreme cold, possibly located in the Arctic regions. Some scholars suggest it could refer to locations like Iceland, Greenland, or the Shetland Islands. Much later in history, though, the concept of Thule was adopted by an occultist group called the Thule Society in Germany. This group was founded in 1918, shortly after World War I, and the society promoted this mythological version of Germanic history and culture, and a belief in an ancient race known as the Aryans. They were fascinated with Nordic mythology and the idea of a lost land that connected to their vision of racial purity. You can see where all this was going. Some of those prominent members of the Thule Society, like Heinrich Himmler, went on to hold prominent positions in the Third Reich. The Chachapoyas were often called the warriors of the clouds, which is incredibly cool. They were an ancient culture that lived once again in the Andes, specifically in the cloud forests of what is now northern Peru. They were around until the Inca Empire conquered them just before the Spanish arrived in the 16th century. The Chachapoyas were tough fighters and resisted Inca control, which made their incorporation into the empire a drawn-out, brutal process. Now, most of what we know about these folks comes from the accounts of Inca chroniclers and Spanish conquistadors, so the info is pretty biased. Other than that, though, we do have some archaeological evidence, like ruins, pottery, burial sites, which tells us a fair amount about them. One of the most impressive sites is Cuelap, a fortress with these massive stone walls and buildings. Sadly, by the 18th century, though, their population had been greatly reduced, mostly thanks to the impact of Spanish colonization. The Chachapoyas had a unique culture, and even though they were absorbed by the Incas, traces of their heritage can still be found in modern indigenous people in Peru. Some locals still hold on to traditions and customs that may have been passed down from the Chachapoyas. Hyperborea is a legendary place from ancient Greek mythology described as a paradise far to the north, somewhat similar to Thule. And according to the myths, the Hyperboreans were a race of giant, peaceful people who lived in this ideal land where the sun, surprisingly, even though it was so far north, shone 24/7. It's said to be a place free from war, sickness, and all the troubles that plagued the rest of humanity. Stories about Hyperborea were mostly passed down through writings from ancient historians like Herodotus and Pindar, describing the land as this lush place filled with natural beauty and abundant resources. Some even claimed that Hyperboreans had advanced knowledge and skills in arts and crafts far beyond what was known in the rest of the world. The Greeks had various theories about where Hyperborea was located. Some placed it in northern Europe, like Britain or Scandinavia. Others suggested it could be further east, possibly even in Asia. Lemuria was a hypothetical continent proposed by zoologist Philip Schlater in 1864. He suggested that it sank beneath the Indian Ocean. The place was said to be a sunken land bridge and was originally used to explain why lemur fossils were found in Madagascar and India, but not in Africa or the Middle East. Then biologist Ernst Haeckel claimed Lemuria could have been the ancestral home of humans. Over time, Lemuria started being written about by occultists, especially Helena Blavatsky, who integrated it into her mystical beliefs. Once plate tectonics became a known thing, though, the sunken land bridge of Lemuria became an outdated theory, but there are remnants of this theory that are still around in certain conspiratorial circles. Percy Harrison Fawcett was a British explorer known for his expeditions in South America, particularly in the Amazon. He made 7 major trips between 1906 and 1924. He was generally well received by the locals, who said he was a pretty respectable man, which is nice to hear about an explorer from that part of time. In 1908, Fawcett traced the source of the Rio Verde, and as he continued to explore these uncharted territories, he began speaking about a lost city he called Z. He'd heard legends about this sophisticated civilization that once existed in the Amazon, and he believed that remnants of it could still be found. His theories were partly based on a document known as Manuscript 512, which detailed an ancient city with ruins, statues, and hieroglyphics discovered by a Portuguese explorer in the 18th century. After serving in World War I, Fawcett returned to Brazil. He was determined to find this lost city of Z, and in 1924 he embarked on his final expedition with his son Jack and friend Rayleigh Rimmel. The last message from Fawcett was sent on May 29, 1925. After that, they vanished. The Royal Geographical Society declared them lost in 1927. They were never found. Atlantis, a legendary island first mentioned by Plato. According to Plato, Atlantis was a powerful naval empire that existed over 9,000 years before his time, ruling huge territories until it attempted to conquer Athens. This angered the gods, leading to Atlantis sinking into the ocean. Now, is Atlantis just a work of fiction, or could there be more to it than that? Some scholars think that there may be elements of the story that were inspired by real events. Ancient disasters could have contributed to this myth of a lost civilization that sank. Throughout history, there have been countless interpretations of Atlantis. Some ancient philosophers viewed it as more of a metaphor for arrogance and the dangers of imperialism. Others just believed it to be a straight-up factual event. Crantor, an ancient Greek philosopher, claimed that Egyptian priests had evidence of its existence. Now, over the centuries, a number of locations have been theorized for Atlantis, and it's anywhere from sites in the Mediterranean to Antarctica. Real or not, though, it's hard not to say Atlantis isn't still alive to this day. It might sound a bit corny, but the myths and legends about it, the conspiracies about its existence, kinda keep it alive in a way.
First up in our number 10 spot, we have the Mayans. You've probably heard of the Maya civilization. They were an ancient Mesoamerican group dating back as early as 2000 BC that developed in what is now modern-day Mexico, Guatemala, Belize, Honduras, and El Salvador. Now, in terms of looking back through today's lens, the Mayans are acclaimed for many things. They developed one of the few fully developed writing systems of the ancient Americas. They had an incredible understanding of astronomy and created complex calendrical systems. They had complex agricultural systems, and potentially, most famously, they are praised for their impressive architecture, like massive temples, pyramids, palaces, and ball courts that can still be explored today. So, what exactly happened to them? Archaeologists are still trying to figure that out. By 600 CE, the Maya had built thousands of cities around Central America, but the bustling society can be dated as beginning to decline in the 8th and 9th centuries by archaeologists. Some theories for this include drought, foreign invasion, collapse of trade routes, and disease are all theories, but as of yet, no one can pinpoint once and for all what happened to the Mayan people all those years ago. Moving on to number 9, Easter Island. You are likely familiar with the giant head statues called moai that adorn the island, but who exactly was it that created them? Experts say they were made by Rapa Nui people who are believed to have traveled to the island in the middle of the South Pacific using wooden outrigger canoes and settled there between 300 and 1200 CE. Now, although the moai are the most famous remaining evidence of the Rapa Nui were also considered a thriving society with a population of around 12,000 at its peak. That was until the arrival of the first European explorers in 1722. Tragically, similarly to other indigenous cultures who came into contact with settlers, the Europeans' initial arrival and following visits brought diseases, and over time explorers reported fewer and fewer inhabitants as the years went on, until eventually the population dwindled to less than 100. While disease was definitely a factor, officially no one can agree on a definitive reason as to what caused the decline of the island's inhabitants or its society. It's likely that the island couldn't sustain enough resources for such a large population, plus deforestation and the extinction of certain animal species are often linked to the decline of the island's ecosystem. Moving on to number 8, the Roanoke colony. Back in 1587, during the time that Europeans were heading to colonize the world, a group of 100 settlers found the small island of Roanoke, now modern-day Dare County in North Carolina, and decided to make it their new home. Shortly after the group settled, it was determined that the man John White would be the leader of the group, likely due to the fact his wife had just given birth to their daughter Virginia Dare, making her the first ever English-born child in the New World. However, after some time in the colony, John headed back to England in search of more supplies for his town. What was meant to be a short visit accidentally turned into a 3-year stay due to the Anglo-Spanish War. However, once he was permitted to return, he made his way back to America, only to find that his entire colony had vanished out of thin air. They looked around for clues for where they could have gone, but there was no sign of battle and no graves reported in the area, seemingly pointing towards the idea that they had moved to a new location. All John found was the word Croatoan carved into a single wooden post, and to this day the disappearance of the Roanoke colony remains a giant mystery.
Next, we are talking about the Nazca Lines. The Nazca Lines, those enormous geoglyphs etched into the Peruvian desert, have long been a mystery. Some think they were made as offerings to the gods, while others believe they were designed to be seen by extraterrestrials. But what if these lines were actually time markers? Spread across miles of barren land, they form intricate patterns that align with the stars, suggesting that the ancients had a deep understanding of celestial events. Some researchers believe these patterns weren't just artistic, they may have been designed to mark significant moments in time, pointing to a hidden knowledge about future astronomical phenomena or events that would shape the world centuries later. Next, we are talking about the Pyramids of Giza. The Great Pyramid of Giza is aligned with the stars of Orion's belt with such precision that it could be a message from the ancients. This pyramid isn't just an impressive feat of architecture, it might be an ancient timekeeping device. The Egyptians were known for their astronomical knowledge, and the pyramid's alignment with the stars suggests that the pyramids could have been used as a tool to track time, marking specific moments in history, and perhaps even predicting the future. Was this massive structure built not only to honor the pharaohs, but also as a cosmic clock to mark the passing of time, or could it have even been used to peer into future events? Next up, we are talking about the Hindu Kala Chakra. Ancient Hindu texts speak of the Kala Chakra, or the Wheel of Time, which represents time as a continuous cycle. Birth, death, and rebirth. This idea of cyclical time suggests that what happens in one era is destined to repeat in the next. This concept goes beyond philosophical musings and touches on something far more profound. Ancient Hindu texts like the Mahabharata seem to suggest that civilizations may rise and fall in a loop, with future events somehow tied to past actions. Could ancient civilizations have understood that time wasn't a straight line, but a series of repeating cycles, allowing them to anticipate future events based on the rhythms of the past? Next, we are talking about the Inca's astronomical knowledge. The Inca civilization was one of the most advanced in terms of its understanding of time. They crafted calendars based on lunar and solar cycles, designed perfectly to predict agricultural seasons and celestial events. But this wasn't just about farming. The Inca also believed that these cycles determined the fate of the empire. Some experts believe the Inca could predict major events, including the rise and fall of dynasties, using these astronomical observations. This suggests that the Inca may have known more about the future than just the weather. Their calendar systems could have been fine-tuned instruments, allowing them to read time and the future like an open book. Next, we are talking about the Sumerians and the Anunnaki. The ancient Sumerians, regarded as one of the first great civilizations, left behind texts that tell of the Anunnaki, gods who supposedly arrived from the stars with advanced knowledge. These beings, according to Sumerian lore, had the ability to shape the future and impart their knowledge to humanity. Some scholars suggest that the Anunnaki may have shared knowledge of future technological advancements, predicting things like space travel and even the genetic manipulation of humans. Could these ancient gods have left behind not just warnings, but actual time-based knowledge to guide the Sumerians, and perhaps even influence the course of future history? Next, we are talking about the ancient Book of the Dead. The Book of the Dead, an ancient Egyptian text, wasn't just a manual for navigating the afterlife, it was a guide to understanding the passage of time beyond death. The Egyptians viewed time as a cyclical force, with life and death not as opposing forces, but as interconnected. They believed that by understanding the timing of their rituals and aligning themselves with the stars, they could manipulate the flow of time. Could this ancient belief in eternal life be tied to an understanding of time travel? The idea that the soul transcends time suggests that the Egyptians might have had access to knowledge beyond their immediate era, possibly even glimpsing at events that were yet to come. And finally, to end this list today, we are talking about the ancient sea explorers. Ancient civilizations like the Phoenicians are credited for some of the earliest long-distance sea voyages, but their knowledge may have gone beyond simple navigation. It's believed that these explorers used their astronomical knowledge not just to chart the seas, but to predict the future, aligning their journeys with celestial patterns that held significance for future events. Some theorists believe these voyages were part of a much larger plan, with ancient mariners secretly navigating through time by syncing their travels with the cycles of the stars. Were these ancient sea explorers simply ahead of their time, or did they know how to unlock the secrets of time travel through the stars?